Ironically enough, I'm actually recording this after I've done my Neverwinter Nights 2 review, which I did several days ago, actually. But, I really did feel like doing both videos side by side in release time. So, here we are. Now, one other thing that I know several of you have been wondering, and I suppose I could have answered this earlier, but it's actually hard to get information out without just doing it in videos, believe it or not, because not everyone's on the forums. I don't know how many people even check them. And I don't even know how many people look at my channel comments, for example. But anyways, I'm sorry. Moving along. Let's stop rambling for a second. Yes, I will be talking about Neverwinter Nights 1's primary campaign, the main campaign, vanilla campaign, whatever you want to call it. I will also be talking about the Shadows of Untitled and Hordes of the Underdark. Now let's start with talking about the concept of video game canon, okay? What I mean by this is it's actually kind of a rarity that a pre-existing setting will have a video game come out with that setting, and that video game will actually matter for the canon of that setting. In fact, I can only think of a very small number of games like this. Baldur's Gate and Baldur's Gate 2 come to mind. Both KOTOR and KOTOR 2 are part of official canon with Star Wars, things like that. And there are a couple of Star Trek games which are also similarly considered canon by most people. The fact that Roddenberry is now dead, rest his soul, means that it's kind of hard to discern what is actually Star Trek canon or not, so shrug. After all, several people tend to think of Threshold as not canon, me included, and some people tend to think of Star Trek the Motion Picture as not canon, and there's actually some pretty good evidence for that, so shrug. Anyways, I'm sorry, my point I'm trying to get here is that it's actually quite rare to see a video game done in a setting that actually is canon, especially a video game specifically. I mean, I never mind the concepts of other things like books and comic books and things like that. Having a video game actually be part of canon is very rare. I bring this all up because, as I have mentioned in my Neverwinter Nights 2 review, both Neverwinter Nights 1 and 2 are actually a part of canon. And I think that's awesome. And the fact that they pull it off so well is part of why they are a part of canon. In order to do so, in order to make a game for a series that you want to be a part of that series, that you want to be considered a part of the extended continuity, you basically have to know a great deal about the source material you're writing within, okay? Now that is harder to do than it sounds, especially within a setting such as Forgotten Realms. Faerun is huge, and has a lot going on, and has a lot in every aspect, even when you're doing a game that is ultimately centered in one tiny little section over here, over Neverwinter Nights. It is difficult to keep everything in line because you're going to have bits and pieces from the rest of the world interacting within this, right? Now, I mention all of this to give praise basically right out of the bat here. I consider Neverwinter Nights 1 and its two expansions to be absolutely amazing games, and if it weren't for the UE problems, I would probably replay them more often. I feel like I say that about a lot of old games, but it's true. They are very well constructed. They are very well developed. The voice acting is not as often as I would like. I would prefer if there was more voice acting, but the voice acting that is there is good. And the story is nothing short of phenomenal, in my opinion, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's talk about gameplay first and foremost. One of the things that happened between Baldur's Gate and Planescape Torment and the other old school second edition video games, and Neverwinter Nights, which was the first of the third edition, or 3.5, actually forget which, D&D video games, was that they took a look at all the rules in D&D that they had basically been translating copy-paste from the rulebook to the game, which is something you can do, by the way. It's not actually that hard to do. And they decided, let's not do that anymore. Let's look at the D&D rules and let's adapt them in a way that makes sense to a video game. Neverwinter Nights 1 may not be the actual first game to do this. If there's another one, I don't know about it off the top of my head. My apologies. But it is the first one that I played and that I was aware of, where they actually basically made what is effectively a new D&D rule set. It is still based on 3.0 or 3.5, I don't remember which, and I don't care, because it's all 3. But what it is ultimately another edition, 3.5V, because this is the video game version. The rules were slightly modified to make more sense within a video game setting, and I thought it was a brilliant idea. In fact, for a fair amount of time there, because I was GMing, obviously, back then. I've been GMing for years upon years, if that's not obvious. I actually started implementing house rules that were based off of the video games variants that had been introduced in Neverwinter Nights because they made so much sense to me. And several of the players are like, "Huh?" A good example of this is extensive use of the diplomacy school skill as something that is actually supposed to be used in virtually any given NPC or even other player interaction, rather than what it is in the book, which is basically useless, or not completely useless, just basically useless. Or, for example, the existence of an appraise skill in order to actually identify items without casting, identify, or going into town and flinging 100 gold at someone. Stuff like that. I really enjoyed the system they implemented, and it worked very well, especially since, and this is incredibly important, there was a pause feature. Now, yes, the Baldur's Gates and whatnot, and that era of game also had a pause feature, and yes, I think it was critical for those games as well. But the reason it's critical is because the rule that has been in existence for many years, and never has been this been stronger in Neverwinter Nights, is the 6 second rule. Every 6 seconds is a turn, okay? When I say a turn, I mean if you are familiar with D&D, let's say there are 3 enemy guys and 4 party members, okay? That means 7 full turn actions have to take place within the space of 6 seconds. Now, this is one of the reasons that combat tends to slow down so much in tabletop D&D, and I have spent many years trying to perfect more and more methods in order to streamline that, because I feel that that's a detriment to the game as a whole. But in a video game, you have a unique circumstance of that thing that just took, 10 minutes to roll out all 7 people's turns literally takes 6 seconds, 6 real seconds within the game, and it has to keep track of all that once. Now, while that's obviously awesome for many reasons, which I've already alluded to, sometimes it gets ahead of you. And so the ability to say, whoa, whoa, pause, pause, okay. I need you to do this, and you to do this, and you to do this, and you to do this. Okay, unpause. You know, really adds it so that if you feel like it, especially if you're on harder difficulties, in which case this is basically a requirement, you can be a lot more strategic, and that's actually the wrong word. You can be a lot more tactical about your approach in the way this combat unfolds. Now, one of the other benefits of this, and of something else I'll mention here in just a second, is that you have the availability to do what most D&D people have wanted to do in tabletop for years and never actually been able to do because it's so mind-numbingly time-consuming in order to do it on tabletop. And what I mean is have actually large-scale battles. Have massive amounts of enemies coming at your party. Even if you're playing Neverwinter Nights with just yourself, if you haven't picked up a companion, at most you have 2 people in your party, right? You and your companion. That's 2 people. Now, if you're actually playing D&D, it is possible for those 2 people to take on 70 guys, okay? It's going to be rough, especially at early levels, but you can do it. However, in a video game, taking on those 70 guys will take a couple of minutes. In tabletop, that may take the better part of a few hours. You follow me here? And so that was a unique perspective, a unique possibility that Neverwinter Nights was the first game to really expand upon. Yes, you had mass combat to an extent in the earlier games, but Neverwinter Nights, you had really mass combat. Even in the first few stages, even before you hit level 5, you were fighting dozens upon dozens of enemies and mowing through them. And that is also helped by another thing, which I said I was going to talk about here in a second here, which is the ability to rest under certain circumstances in order to act as a full 8 hours of rest. In tabletop, for those of you who don't know, you have to actually get 8 hours of rest. It's a generalized rule, and there are specific rules if you want to get down to the nitty-gritty. For example, if you're in a dungeon and if you need certain circumstances to be set in order to actually regain all your abilities and whatnot. But in general, you basically need to rest for a full period of 8 hours in order to get all your stuff back, right? Even if you're an elf, you still have to meditate. If you are in Neverwinter Nights, you have to be nowhere near an enemy. Now, this can actually get somewhat irritating because of certain features of the game, but the point is, don't be in range of any given enemy, even if you can't see them, and don't be in combat with anybody, and you hit the rest button. And it takes 8 seconds, ironically, and then there you go. You've just gotten your full 8 hours of rest. All your spells have been renewed. All your dailies abilities have been renewed. Everything is back. I have heard some people complain about that, but I argue strongly in favor of that because, again, this is a video game, and what that does is it enables people to... It enables the developers to actually do things like throw waves upon waves of enemies after you. It enables them to have multiple boss fights. It enables them to basically increase the difficulty, relatively speaking, so that the whole adventure feels more epic. And instead of having, like, okay, let's say if they hadn't did that. Let's say if you actually had to go back to town to rest. let's say they scale everything back so it's not too severe, you still have the problem where you get, say, halfway through the docks, for example, right there in the beginning in Neverwinter Nights itself, and you're starting to get beat up and you're not completely out of spells because you're only level 2, and you're like, okay, you stop everything, go back to town, go to the inn, rest, see the little black screen, come back up, go back, go all the way back to the dock, and then go back to where you were. That is what we in the business call flow breaking. This is the primary reason they introduced this, even ignoring the difficulty possibilities. In early editions of Neverwinter Nights, when they were first talking about this, that was one of the first things that they decided upon because it was so flow breaking. It was so jarring to be like, yeah, done, going through this place and taking all these guys. Okay, hang on, pause, pause. Okay, I'm ready to keep going. Yeah, you know that just breaks up the flow so badly, and so the rest button was a brilliant idea for a video game like this, I believe. Now, one of the other reasons, yes, I'm still talking about the same topic, is that in actual tabletop, if you have the availability to rest, if you have the circumstance to rest, basically you can say, we're going to rest for the next several hours. And in real life terms, that only takes a few seconds because you don't have to actually roleplay 8 hours of sleep unless something happens in the interim, right? Now, something can happen in the interim, and by the way, you can be interrupted in rest state if something approaches you or gets near you while you're doing it. But the general point is, in real life terms, you don't have to spend forever and a day. It's not flow breaking to be like, alright, let's get some rest. So it still conveys that same general sense of role playing and of D&D into the video game format, which I think is very well done. Now, one of the other things they added in Neverwinter Nights, and I've heard differing perspectives on this. I personally like this, but that's because I'm a transport kind of guy and I like convenience. They added the ability to basically teleport back to your home base in the vanilla campaign, more or less at will, with a unique little artifact that let you go. And then if you could go back to the spot, or you could pay money to go back to the spot. There are a few rules on how this worked. I'm not going to detail all of them, but in general, if you okay, the way it worked is if you died, you would be brought back in the hometown, and you would have lost some experience, and then you could go straight back to where you were for a fee, or you could teleport to the leader, who, if you're playing in a party with other people, for example, and you could do kind of bouncing off of each other in order to keep having free teleports until the point at which gold is no longer necessary, or a big deal, which doesn't take long, by the way. And so it added a layer of convenience to the whole thing. I will admit that it was a little bit overdone in some cases, and I think that the method by which they had the death mechanic and the teleport mechanic in Hordes of the Underdark worked a lot better, in my opinion. But nevertheless, I do think it was a good idea overall, even if it needed to be refined a bit more to be able to teleport back and forth like that. Now, as usual, I'm going to mention that would prefer, if you have any interest in these games, go ahead and go out and play them. I will add a couple of caveats, okay? Neverwinter Nights, Shadows of Untitled, and Neverwinter Nights, Hordes of the Underdark. All three of these are a single story, okay? The way it works is Neverwinter Nights primary is over here. This is relative length here, okay? Now, Shadows of Untitled is actually no, it's like right about here-ish, and it's much shorter in overall length. And then Hordes of the Underdark actually occurs over here and is significantly bigger and completes the stories of both of the previous. Now, for those of you who are wondering, this is actually the story of two different adventurers. There is the adventurer that you play over here in Neverwinter Nights Primary, and then both Shadows of Untitled and Hordes of the Underdark is the same individual player character. Even if you decide to re-roll, lore-wise, you are the same character from the previous expansion, if you follow me. So, in general, if you don't really feel like playing the whole thing through, and I know a couple people who don't, I would recommend playing through Shadows of Untitled and Hordes of the Underdark in that order. And you'll miss a few things, and you won't get the full experience, but it will be overall a more enjoyable experience because those two games, well, I'll get to that more detail later, but generally they are better done than the original vanilla campaign. Now, all that being said, I have now given my usual spoiler warning that I give in like any game that I recommend, amongst which this is one. Now that the spoiler warning's out of the way, I do very much enjoy the story of all three of these games, or rather the overarching story of this overall Neverwinter Nights 1 arc, or 2 arc, or 3 arc, or however you want to define it. One of the things I like most about it is everything I talked about the canon thing previously. They took an element that had basically not really been examined to great detail within Faerun, which is the lizard guys whose species name I can't think of right now, and fleshed them out into being a real villain, into being a real problem. Added this whole cult, added the Archmage who took over Luskan? Was that the name of the place? I suddenly can't think of the name of the town. The opposing town in Neverwinter, which you actually go to during the course of the game. They actually took all the elements of Faerun, didn't actually change. Well, they changed a few things. They changed the status quo in a few circumstances, and a few of these effects did have impact on the setting. But overall, they didn't. They kept true to it, is what I'm saying, which is one of the reasons it stayed canon. One of the reasons it is still part of continuity. Similarly, one of the things they did very well is Neverwinter Nights, while technically your standard epic story, is actually, in my opinion, smaller into overall scope and epicness and feel than Shadows of Unrentide, even though Shadows of Unrentide is essentially a module when you get down to it, and a very big module, mind you. But you're supposed to end that game at like level 10 to 15-ish, something like that, whereas Hordes of the Underdark, which is a much larger module, or much harder campaign, really, and you're supposed to actually get into epic levels in that one, feels even more epic. But my point is, across all three of these settings, despite the fact that it goes like this, 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 it is still a slant upwards across all three. Neverwinter Nights certainly had high stakes, but ultimately those stakes only got raised in both the successive games. You follow with me in this? Now, one of the other things I liked about Neverwinter Nights is they really start off with a bang. And I'm not just talking about the Academy scene, although that was an excellent tutorial. Probably one of the better forms of tutorials I've seen. Only bested by games such as Half-Life 2, for example, as many people have pointed out. Half-Life 2 had a brilliant tutorial system. But in this game, you did kind of literally get a tutorial in this academy. You go to a couple people, you learn the interface in the UE, which is essential. Let's make this clear, because the UE does have problems. I'll talk about that later. But you learn how everything works, and then you get to the scene where Erebeth is like, "Welcome, and I am voice acting now." No offense to the woman, she actually does a decent job of it. It's just, she sounds a little bit too much like she's on fairy dust, if you know what I mean, during these first few scenes. And you and then all hell breaks loose, and then you fight your way through the academy, and you get your way out. And all of this is still in service of the tutorial, if you understand what I mean. It's basically, all right, here's the basics, now apply them, is the way it was presented. And I actually really liked how they did that. I actually rather like that academy section. I've played it many times, because occasionally I would try a different class combo just to try something different. And then I decided I didn't like it, and I'd, start over. But, one of the most amusing things that's ever happened to me, I just feel like sharing this if you don't mind, is I was playing a sorcerer who had 2 or 4 HP. I don't remember which. It was not a lot to start with. And right as you get outside of the academy room, after Erebeth has her little speech, you get right outside, and there's a bunch of, well, there's only like 3 little goblin guys. They've got like 1 HP each, and I died. I died to those stupid goblin things because I had so little HP, and I was just like, wow, okay. Something about that really amused me. I don't call that a negative in the gameplay. I just had to be smarter about how I approached the game. But wow. Anyways, even ignoring all this academy business, the game really does start off with a bang, so to speak, and not the kind of bang that is loud or ostentatious, if that makes any sense, because the very first chapter of the game is all about being stuck in Neverwinter with a massive plague going about. Your entire first part of the game is trying to get together pieces of a cure for this plague that people have invented, and that's really what it is. It's effectively a fetch quest. It's just an extremely epic and awesome fetch quest. You go, there are 4 or 5, I don't actually remember, districts within Neverwinter, not counting the main one. Each one of these has a piece of the cure. Each one of these has its own little story arc that's relatively unconnected to the others. Each one of these also, and this is BioWare storytelling style in its prime here, each one of these also has a beautiful degree of subtlety and hints going on, foreshadowing about what's actually going on. Every single one of these has just enough of a hint about what's really going on that, as I was talking about in my Bioshock review, on a replay through, it actually makes a lot more sense what's going on, and that's one of the reasons I enjoyed replaying Neverwinter Nights 1, was to be like, oh, okay. Now, there are also quite a few side quests, and one of the things I will definitely give Neverwinter Nights 1 props for is making quests matter with regards to gameplay in addition to story. I'm the kind of guy who tends to do a quest if it'll give me an extra line of dialogue. Yeah, seriously, just one line of dialogue. I'm not kidding. I love dialogue, I love characterization, I love lore, I love plot. Surely I've made this clear by now. But I definitely give props for when they do that and make it actually gameplay relevant. For example, in all of Neverwinter Nights, but most especially in this first section in Chapter 1, within Neverwinter itself, every single one of those side quests gives you some kind of reward that is significant. It might be a decent chunk of gold, it might be a significantly decent weapon or cloak or whatever. Some of this gear you're not going to replace for some time because it's superior to what else you're going to find other than from other quests, right? And I actually rather liked that. Um, Part of the reason I like that is because it gives people a reason to do the quests, of course, but it also I'm trying to think how to put this. I've heard some people complain about that because they prefer dungeon crawling. They prefer going down and killing an uber boss who has the loot, and then you get the loot off of him, rather than doing a quest and being rewarded with the loot. Some people prefer that method, and I have nothing wrong with that. But one of the reasons I like that in this case specifically is there are very few actual dungeons within the concept of Neverwinter Nights' first act, which is within the city, because you're still confined here because of the plague. And so I like the idea of people who are in this dire situation, who are sufficiently stressed that they're willing to part with these valuable items that they probably wouldn't be willing to otherwise, except that the situation is dire and they need an adventurer to try and help them out. And you already have some kind of a rep, even if you're playing an evil character, to help out and do what you can and that kind of thing in order to actually get whatever it is they need done. A great example of that is the guy who wants the animals freed from the zoo, for example, and I don't remember what he gets you, but it was something nice. Or how about the cloak of the many stars, which you get if you do the little Zephyr quest and all the zones, stuff like that. Very nice gear, and I liked that. It gave a gameplay reason in addition to a lore reason to keep doing these side quests in addition to the main quest. Speaking of the evil and good thing, I'd like to talk about that now, if I may. It is my opinion that the best game to date to do the evil-good dichotomy thing in gameplay terms is Dragon Age. I've talked about that why over in Dragon Age. I'm going to only discuss it very briefly right here. In Dragon Age, there was no light-dark meter. There was rep with certain characters, and doing good acts around good characters would get you rep with them, and bad acts, blah blah blah. Use your brain. But overall, there were oftentimes no reward, no tangible reward, no increase in your light meter, no, uh, not renegade, paragon, no paragon points for doing things. You just did something that because it was the right thing to do. And oftentimes, what they went out of their way to do was make the voice actors show genuine gratitude and actually try and convey that thankfulness within their tone as the reward, if that makes any sense. Now follow me on this. The whole point was that they wanted people who wanted to play good characters to do so because they wanted to be good characters, not because there would be a reward for doing so, not because they felt like they were forced to do so, but because they actually chose that path. This is why I think Dragon Age is superior in this matter. Neverwinter Nights is actually very, very similar to this, and arguably the prototype for this. In Neverwinter Nights, you do have an alignment, but it affects basically nothing. It does affect a few items, it does affect a few spells, and that's basically it. In general, it's there cosmetically, if you know what I mean. So if you do something evil, it's because you choose to do something evil. If you do something good, it's because you choose to do something good. And most of the time, there's not going to be a reward for either, in many cases. I mentioned, when did I mention that? Was that my Bioshock? In my Bioshock review, I mentioned a specific scene, which I'm going to mention again now, so forgive me for the repetition. But you might not have seen the Bioshock review. While you're going through the docks, you come across a guy who has just had to burn his house down because his family had become infected with the plague and they were dying, and he was the only way to put them out of their misery. This man is genuinely miserable and lamentable and is just, oh, I've got nothing left. And you can, through certain dialogue options, get to the point where you basically rob this guy. Now, all you get out of this is a few gold, or the shirt off his back or something like that. You basically get nothing. But that's kind of my point. Even for being such a horribly evil person, you don't actually get a particular reward out of it, any more than you get any reward out of giving him some gold, which you also have an option to do in order to help him start over again. Both options are done because you, the player, want to see things unfold slightly differently, and while it doesn't have a long-term impact, because A, this is kind of an old game, and B, even in modern age, having long-term impact from small decisions is something that we still haven't mastered in video games. Nevertheless, doing that had an impact on the moment, if that makes any sense. That scene unfolded differently based on the choice you made, and the choice you made was the one you made because you wanted to, not because you wanted to be rewarded for it. Now, there are some exceptions, of course, because this is still an older game, and they still had the concept of you have to have a reward at every step, and they were still stepping out of that, but for the most part, most of the times when you could be clearly good or clearly evil, there is no real tangible benefit to doing either. It's just because it's to determine what kind of flavor to the overall scene you want, and I like that. I like that quite a lot. And in case any of you are wondering, given that most of you know that I tend to play the Mario type character, which is a very good, I'm here to help everyone kind of character. The reason I know that is Neverwinter Nights 1 is multiplayerable. And so I was playing with a friend, and we were going through the docks, and I was taking out some bandits nearby, and I saw the dialogue pop up, and I'm like, "Meow." And it wasn't one I could interact with because the other guy had talked to the guy, and the other guy was the one. And I'm just reading this with like growing shock and almost hilarity because the dialogue options are so utterly wrong. It's almost cartoonish. Aha! You still have the clothes off of your back. Clearly you have something. Give me your money or I'll kill you. And then the guy's like, so kill me. I don't care. And then he's like, oh, but I'm with the city guard. I'll tell them that you burned your house down and killed your family. And then you'll be thrown in jail. And then you'll be even more miserable than now. And the guy's like, no, please, that would be a fate worse than death. Here's my money. It's horrible, but it's done in an almost comical way, if that makes any sense. It's very strange. But that is one of the things I actually like about Neverwinter Nights. Most of the evil acts you can do are designed to be more comical than making a making a Wookiee beat his Twi'lek friend for life to death right in front of you with his bare hands. That's just screwed up, and I bet several of you out there know the exact instance I'm referring to. But in Neverwinter Nights, in general, most of those evil acts you could take were a lot more, snidely whiplash kind of a thing. Now, I've been dancing around this issue this whole time. The Yui. The Yui of this game takes some getting used to. Period. End of statement. Unlike most of the, okay, for those of you who don't know, the same basic engine. I do stress basic. It has been improved over the years, but the same basic engine that was developed here in Neverwinter Nights 1 is the same basic engine that virtually every BioWare game that has ever come out since has been placed on. KOTOR, Dragon Age 2, Mass Effect, all of these have been based upon this same basic engine. I mention that because I have heard people talk about how difficult KOTOR is to play, how difficult Dragon Age is to play, how difficult Mass Effect 1 is to play. If you have trouble playing these games, please do not pick up Neverwinter Nights 1, because this is the granddaddy of those, and it had its own issues, rather significant ones I might add. Even ignoring possibility of bugs, which I'm not even touching. I'm not even going to go into bugs that this game still had, even after the many patches it went through. There were basic problems with it. Such, for example, camera control is just irritating and slow, and several people I know have tried to play in what BioWare would actually later make an option, which is the basically the third-person perspective from behind thing, like a third-person shooter, instead of the top-down perspective, which is what it was actually designed to be played as. That doesn't work out so well, from what I understand, and most people I know have given up on doing so. Similarly, especially if you're doing co-op play, while I am a huge proponent of co-op play, especially in a D&D game, it isn't really all that well coded. Sometimes one person can trigger things that the other person can't. Sometimes the quests get so bugged you have to revert save several steps. When a friend and I were going through Hordes of the Underdark particularly, we had to constantly be keeping saves. Both of us, mind you, because occasionally one of our saves would get corrupted and we have to revert to his save, and then his save would get corrupted later on and he have to revert to my save. It was just a mess, which is a mess that we fortunately skipped in Neverwinter Nights 2. We only had one bug within that one, and that was only in Mask of the Betrayer. And that got fixed, sort of. We had to fix that with console commands, which admittedly is not a good thing in favor of a game. But the fact that it was just the one bug rather than the constant barrage of things going wrong was a nice thing. But that is something I have to mention. Now, that is a co-op experience, but even when you're playing single player, it is a good idea to save rather frequently, just because there are issues with this game. Now, speaking with the Yui specifically, one of the things that is harder to do than it sounds is, for example, I want to attack that guy. I want to use this ability here. I want to do this over here. Sometimes the mouse doesn't like to click where you want to click it. Sometimes you can't get the camera in a specific pattern so that you can actually see what you're looking at, that kind of a thing. It's an older game, and as with just about all older games, the UE is going to be a problem. This is almost a universal truth, not completely. Some older games have UEs that are fantastic, which is kind of strange when you really think about it. But for the most part, it's something you have to be keeping in mind. And so I want to give anyone out there who wants to give these games a chance a warning that you have to be keeping that in mind. Now you notice I haven't actually talked that much about spoilers yet, even though I've already warned you about that. Part of that is because I don't actually want to spoil too much of the plot, especially since most of my discussion about these games has to do with their themes in the story and the presentation they're in rather than the story itself. But let's talk about the story itself. Let's go ahead and go into it a little bit. One of the things I heard a lot back in the day was how ham-fistedly Erebeth's turning was handled. Now, I will admit that I think part of that lays on the voice actress who played Erebeth. Part of the problem is the voice actress who played Erebeth was extremely theatrical in her presentation, and while that's usually a good thing, she put a little bit too much into most of her tonality and most of her presentation, and so when she was good, she sounded like she was good, and everything is just wonderful. And when she was evil, she sounded like she was the most evil man or woman known to man. I'm pretty sure she's a woman. Known to elf kind, and they would all pay for buzz. So you get the contrast here. I'm not doing it fully because I don't want to wake anyone up. But my point is that there was a very sharp contrast between the two, and we aren't shown most of the in between. That being said, if you ignore the problems with the voice acting, which admittedly are actually only they don't ruin it, in my opinion. They just make it slightly worse, if that makes any sense. It rubbed in the wrong direction, but it still wasn't bad. Nevertheless, the writing for the character of Erebeth, in my opinion, made perfect sense, especially her overall arc. Now, this is a really big spoiler, okay? I mean, obviously, I've already given away that Erebeth turns evil, which isn't a huge spoiler because you find about that in chapter 2. But this is a bigger spoiler, okay? Okay. You encounter Erebeth in hell, in Hordes of the Underdark. When you go to hell, there you go, big spoiler right there. And that is an awesome section which has lots of Planescape Torment references, which made me go yes every time I saw them. I still to this day sometimes call people Burks. Do you know that? Or tell them to pike off. Yes, seriously, I do. I'm a total geek. What do you want from me? And if you get that reference too, awesome. Now, my point is that you encounter Erebeth within the outer plane of hell, and I think it's the Nine Hells specifically. I forget which layer you're on. And that Erebeth basically talks about the overall arc of her story. And what happens is, if we look at Erebeth's story from the start, she starts off a paladin of justice under Tyr, right? The deity Tyr. And then she sees an incredibly horrific injustice happen to her lover because of stupidity, basically. Because of politics is really actually what it boils down to. Now, she then descends pretty quickly, but it's worth noting that if you talk to her in between every quest during Act 2, before you see her turn, she does actually portray her descent into this nightmare and having these nightmares very quickly. And it is also worth noting that at this point in time, I can't think of his name. The mage bad guy. I think it starts with an M. I seriously can't think of his name. Bad guy mage and the serpent queen are both actively reaching out to manipulate her during this time. So between her own doubt, by the way, she watched her lover get burned alive for a stupid political reason right in front of her. So, yeah, that alone would be enough to turn a paladin, turn anybody, in my opinion. But then added to the fact that two very powerful, very evil people are constantly reaching out to your mind and affecting you, yeah, her fall made perfect sense to me, and I actually thought it was very well written and very well presented. And so she falls, and you defeat her. Now, one of the things I absolutely love is A, usage of romance in a story properly, and B, a good redemption story. I talked way back in my KOTOR 1 review about one of my favorite scenes in the whole game, and that is if you play a Revan who is light side, who is good, whether he's light or dark, and who convinces Bastila to come back to the light side after having been converted to the dark by nothing more than the simple, honest implication and statement that you love her. Now, I talked in that review, in that video, about why that's such a big deal, especially for a Jedi, to full-on admit something that is so forbidden and so taboo by them, and to state, most importantly, that you are not afraid of that feeling, nor are you afraid to show it or commit to it. That is what convinced Bastila to turn back, and I love that. I love that so much that it makes me want to smack every time George Lucas in the face every time he insists that it works the other way. Let's move on. In Neverwinter Nights, if you do things just right in Chapter 2, Erebeth and you start to get quite close. You don't actually develop a romance. That's not really the point. What you do is develop a relationship. And when I use the term relationship, I use the term in the same sense that every human being has a relationship with every other human being they interact with. A relationship that is professional, a relationship that is familial, that kind of thing. It is a close relationship, but it is not a romantic one. Not really. And there are some overtones of what could be romantic. But the point is, at the end of it, she gives you a ring. Now, at the very end of the game, after you've beaten all these things and defeated Erebeth, you fight her down, and she basically demands that you kill her because she has absolutely nothing left. Her lover's dead, her people abandoned her, her deity abandoned her. At the end of the day, she has nothing left. Even her rage cannot sustain her anymore. And then you show her that you still have that ring she gave you, and she is incredulous that you kept it. And again, this is probably BioWare kind of copying themselves here because the tonality of the two scenes is fantastically similar. But it's so well done that I don't mind because again, the implication is so powerful with something so simple. That you held on to this ring means so much to her, even after all she did, even after all you two have been through, even if she tried to kill you more than once. You still held on to this ring. It still meant something to you, and you bring her back. You bring her back from the abyss, and she is redeemed. She redeems herself. I loved that, and I loved the way it was presented. And moving forward, in Hordes of the Underdark, you find out that what happened was that she continued to follow this guy, whoever he was, and he himself was actually banished from Neverwinter Nights for standing up for Erebeth, basically. And so he ended up being cast away and ends up dying as a result of this. And Erebeth ends up taking her own life and ends up in the Hells because it's this Faerun. And the way her story ends depends on your choices. And there's many ways it can go. You can force her back to the dark. You can try and redeem her again. You can try and you can actually have a relationship with her. It's kind of brief. I'm not sure why you'd want to do that. But there are so many different options there. But in all of them were well presented enough that it made perfect sense. From that point in time, from having gone from for Erebeth to dive fully into the darkness makes perfect sense. Or for Erebeth to renounce the darkness once and for all and says, I'm done with this, also makes perfect sense to me. And that's one of the reasons I really like Erebeth as the title character, so to speak. Even though she's not the player character, though she's not even mentioned in Shadows of Untitled, she is in many ways a poster character for the Neverwinter Nights 1 arcs in its entirety. And I think it was extremely well portrayed and very well done personally. Now, I'm not going to talk about every single one of the companions that comes with you, because that would make this video very, very long. Every single one of them has a long and involved story, and every single one of them is awesome. That's my summary right there, okay? For those of you who are curious, I tended to go with the half... shoot, I suddenly can't think of his... no, okay, no, I gotta look this up. Hang on just a second. No, wrong window. Wrong button. Neverwinter Nights. Companions. What were their names? Here we go. This is exactly what I'm looking for. I just want to go down the name. There are two I want to talk about specifically, and I really want to know what is the name. Okay, here we go. All right. Here we go. Okay, so many of these are recurring. For example, in the first you have Body Knock Glinkle. I always have trouble with that name. He's a gnomish sorcerer. You know what? Let me take a step back. Let me start with something else. One of the things that Neverwinter Nights done that was an incredibly good idea was they had a variety of companions within the vanilla campaign that were designed to help balance out you. Whatever you wanted to play, there was some companion who could balance out your weaknesses with their strengths, right? Now they continued this throughout the rest, but it is something that was extremely well done, extremely well presented, and one of the real selling points of them, in my opinion. Okay, so Body Knock Glinkle was an extremely amusing character. He's a sorcerer, lawful neutral, and that doesn't really matter that much. But anyways, he is someone who is extremely useful if you're a Puron melee, and if you're going to be, and you don't really want to deal with stuff, or if you're a healer, for example. Grimna, who is a dwarven monk who follows, I can't think of it, his or her name for that matter. He's got a little bit of a death fixation. He's got some issues. We have Leonora. She is arguably one of my favorite characters in the first in the main thing because she is absolutely hilarious. So much of the comedy of the original Neverwinter Nights 1's campaign is summarized by that character. She is incredibly clumsy. One of the first things you find out about her is you're like, oh, what are you doing here? And she's like, well, I lost a symbol. Okay, why'd you lose a symbol? Well, I accidentally jumped over this thing. Oh, so you dropped it? Well, no, actually. And this just kind of keeps going and going and going and going and going. I strongly recommend you talk to her every time you chance because it's just hilarious. Then you have Sharwin, who is a human bard who is way too full of herself, but props again for developing her out into a real character in addition to just being, an uppity cheerleader. And Tommy Undergallows, who is a halfling rogue, who is also rather amusing, although in a bit more mercenary manner. Those of you who like the halfling in Order of the Stick, whose name I can't think of right now, Belkar, would probably like him. But you'll note, if you've been paying attention and you know this game, you noticed I skipped over someone, and that's the guy I really want to talk about. Dalen Red Tiger. He returns in Hordes of the Underdark, if you were not aware of this fact. He is awesome. He is a half-orc barbarian. Apparently he was just an orc. I was wrong. And he is an interesting character that has a decent amount of depth to him. A lot of it seems cliche, but that's because he's basically it's one of those mask things I've talked about before with characterization where you see the character and you think, oh, he's just a cliche. And then you realize that's just the mask they're holding up in order to hide whatever their real problems are. And Dalen is one of those like characters. He is someone who has a great deal of honor and respect for you and for anybody who does any good, and he tries to maintain this mask of, I'm distant and woe is me kind of character in order to hide so many of the problems that he's had in his life. He has had a rough life, and you find out about it as you go through there. Now, when you get to Shadows of Unrentide, you see Dorna Trapspringer, who is a dwarven rogue cleric. Yes, really. Misha Waymeat, who is a human paladin. Xanos Mesmeros, who is a half-orc sorcerer barbarian, who is just as hilariously over the top as he sounds. And all three of those are, again, well developed, and you can learn quite a bit of them as you go on. But to be honest, I've only taken one of those ever, because every single time I play Shadows of Unrentide, I cannot help but bring the same companion. I have to. I bet you know exactly who I'm talking about. Deacon. Deacon is awesome. I love Deacon. Deacon is a halfling, or not a halfling. Deacon is a bard rogue who can later on become a Red Dragon disciple. And he's a kobold. In Forgotten Realms, mind you. Granted, in some other settings like my own that I'm doing right now, kobolds are significantly more intelligent and more well-to-do than they're usually portrayed, but he's a kobold in FR. And he is awesome. Not only is he hilarious, he is just the right amount of innocent, naive, and cute to make up for the fact that he is both bumbling and he is what I imagined that they wanted Neelix to be over on Voyager, and failed miserably at. Deacon is genuinely endearing, and every time I see him, I just want to be like, yay! Did I mention Deacon is in Neverwinter Nights 2 as well? He's not a character who can actually join your party, unfortunately. He's just hanging out in town as a vendor, selling the best equipment in the game, because he's Deacon. And then, of course, Hordes of the Underdark, you see return of several of the characters, including a couple additional ones. You can have a Drow, who is an assassin, rogue, wizard character, and of course, Erebeth can finally join you, as I kind of hinted at earlier. And there's another guy. Actually, I guess look here. There's a tiefling. That's right, Valen Shadowbreath, who is a good tiefling, by the way, and an awesome character. Although, yes, I still end up using Deacon throughout Hordes of the Underdark because it's Deacon! Although, whenever I'm playing co-op, it's also kind of fun to have the other guy bring one of the other characters I like, and that's one of the reasons I know so much about Dalen's characters, because, my other guy brought him along. Now, like I said, I only wanted to blaze through those really quick, but part of the point I was trying to get across is that every single one of those characters is characterized to such a significant extent that there is no such thing as a wrong choice from a lore perspective, from a story, from a setting, from a characterization perspective. Obviously, if you are playing a fighter and you bring along Dalen, you're probably going to have some issues with gameplay because you're a fighter, he's a barbarian. But if you're willing to put up with that, if you want to play a fighter and you want him to be along because you like his character, that is still possible. I can speak to that from experience because I've done that exact same combination. I have done my usual fighter, Bard Fighter Red Dragon Disciple combo of Doom, which by the way is stupidly powerful, in and grouped up with Dalen before, and it still worked. There's some rough spots, and some of it is really hard, but I can still push through it, you know? Now, if it's not obvious, I really like Neverwinter Nights 1. While I think Neverwinter Nights 2 is a superior game, Neverwinter Nights 1 had, in my opinion, superior characterization for the most part. The story of Neverwinter Nights 2 was better, in my opinion, especially the overall story, but at the same time, the setting of Neverwinter Nights 1 was presented better. I don't like comparing the two because they are ultimately quite different games. After all, one was BioWare and one was Obsidian. But just to give you an idea, Neverwinter Nights 2 feels a lot more down to earth. It feels a lot more provincial, is the word I like to use. You are out to actually save this area, this countryside. Indeed, your home. You were born here. You've lived here. You are even landed. You are given a keep, which is your keep. You become the captain, the commandant. Captain Commander, or whatever the title is they keep using to define you as, and you end up having so much of a personal stake in this area that it feels a lot more down to earth. Even though in Mask of the Betrayer you spend a great deal of time in exotic locales and indeed ending up in an outer plane. In Neverwinter Nights 1, you start off again in Neverwinter in a bad situation. You go out to the countryside relatively quickly. You find out what's going on, end up resolving the situation in Luskan. I think it's Luskan. It's either Luskan or Luxon or something like that. Actually, no, Luxon is the name of the race over in Farscape, so it's something like that. Whatever. And you head up back to the Neverwinter Nights. Again, very very well grounded, but you don't have a lot of freedom of movement because Neverwinter Nights doesn't have the overworld feature like, say, Baldur's Gate 2 did, and like Neverwinter Nights 2 did. So it's relatively linear, all things considered. Once you finish a zone, you can't go back to it. And in fact, there's usually a warning. Once you leave, you can't go back. Finish any quest you want to. And then Shadows of Unrintide takes it to far more exotic locales. You start in a city near Neverwinter, then you head out towards the dunes, whose name I don't remember, forgive me, I don't know the locations that well in Faerun, and you end up in one of the massive cities of the awesome people from the ancient time when magic was super powerful. And okay, so we've already kind of stepped up several steps from what Neverwinter Nights 2 does, and then you end up in Hordes of the Underdark, which starts out in the Undermountain. And if you know what that is, you already know where I'm going with this. And then you encounter you know who himself. Yes, you do, and one of his clones. And then you keep going further down into the actual Underdark, and then you end up in the outer planes of hell. And it just kind of it feels so much more epic in overall presentation than Neverwinter Nights 2 does, as far as setting, as far as presentation, as far as characterization. Even though the story of Neverwinter Nights 2 is one I consider to be superior. I hate to keep comparing these two one to another, but I just want to get across the point again that they are different. That one game is not necessarily indicative of the other. Obviously, similar styles and similar presentation, but you know. Now, one of the things I really, really want to talk about is the fact that Shadows of Unretied and Hordes of the Underdark are vastly superior to the vanilla game. I mentioned this briefly. Giving you a full list of details would take some time, but basically what they did was they refined. They did what a proper expansion should be. You remember how StarCraft to Brood War was overall a better game? The reason why it was a better game was because they knew what they were doing better. They knew how to use the system and triggers. They only added a small amount of functionality to the code, but everything that they did was something they had learned, something they had grown. They were now experienced at working with this system and this engine, and so the expansion was thus much superior. Morrowind is another excellent example. When Tribunal came out, everything that was being presented in Tribunal was superior to the basic stuff in vanilla Morrowind because they knew what they were doing better. Same basic concept here. Shadows of Unretied raised the bar, and Hordes of the Underdark blew it out of the water. Both of those expansions are absolutely amazing, and I could not possibly recommend playing Neverwinter Nights 1 without including both of them in your overall gaming experience. The way the quests are presented are better. The way they use mechanics such as rebirth, or not rebirth, but how you die and how you keep going after that. The way they present cutscenes was better. The way they did the voice acting was better. The way they did the dialogue was better presented. The way that the equipment came out was better. The way they used crafting was better. Everything they did, every single little aspect was better in some way or another, sometimes minor, sometimes severe. And in every single case, it came out to an absolutely amazing experience, which I do strongly recommend. Um, there's probably other things to talk about. I could keep going in full depth about the story. I really could. There's one thing I want to talk about, actually. One thing that I really love about Neverwinter Nights 1 Vanilla's story. And that is the fact that we encounter the lizard people, whose names I can't think of, forgive me. And we are constantly shown that in their time and in their age, they were really powerful. They were one of the they were one of the majority powers in the world, right up there with the dragons, right? And they constantly demonstrate the fact that they are superior to everyone else, and they treat all the other lesser races as little better than we would treat dogs, basically, work dogs, but dogs nonetheless. And yet, every time you encounter them, you clearly show that you are superior to they are. And in many cases, I love this because it's so rare the game will actually acknowledge this. In this case, they actually make that a plot point that people are stronger than they assumed they were. That people are actually more on the ball than they were back then. This is one of the reasons why the main villain actually goes through her whole plague plot in order to try and weaken the world in order to help try and bring them back. Yes, I know there were other primary reasons for it, but you get the point. And so, for example, one of the scenes that I love most is when you actually free one of the lizards, and the lizard is absolutely astonished at how powerful you are, and actually says that. I love that because it is so rare for a game to acknowledge that the PC, in my opinion, should be stronger than everything else walking around. And in this case, it actually highlights it because you are stronger than everything else walking around. And they actually make a point of that as a plot point because they are so far behind. And you get the impression that while these guys are a threat, they think they are a worldwide threat when in fact they are more like a localized regional threat. Still a threat. After all, they're still a threat to your home and your society, and you do want to stop them. But you start to realize that they are not a world-conqueringly destroying threat. And I like that. Especially since, in the course of the next two expansions, the threats we start to encounter are a lot more wide-scale than these lizard people, whose name I can't think of. For example, Mephistopheles, I believe, was the villain of Hordes of the Underdark, the real villain. By the way, spoiler alert. He was definitely a worldwide threat, no question. Someone who was a threat to all of Faerun, whereas the Medusa woman was probably a threat to a good portion of the Northwest continent, but still a larger threat than Lizard Lady was, who was just a threat to this little region. You get where I'm going with. It kind of went like this, and which was a very correct, very proper way to do it. One of the other reasons I liked that was this was still something of an experiment. They wanted a threat that was not worldwide because it's harder to incorporate something that is a worldwide threat into overall canon without having it be defeated basically before it actually causes any problems. If you see where I'm going with this. For example, let's say someone wanted to, if you're familiar with Star Wars extended canon, let's presume we're right about at the point where the Thrawn trilogy has come out, okay, way back when extended canon was starting to be a new thing, and someone wants to do a story about how Coruscant is blown up, okay? Now, that's a huge, massive, incredibly large impact on the overall setting as a whole, and one that everyone after you now has to compensate for because you just blew up Coruscant. Now, you can do that if you do it right, but that is still a very risky move, and if this is your first real forays into canon, that's not what you want to do. You want to have someone who, for example, has the threat of destroying Coruscant, has the capacity to, but never actually accomplishes it because they are stopped. Or you want to have someone who has the capacity to threaten people within the Imperial Palace, for example, something like that. I know these are bad allegories, but bear with me here. My point is, it was a good idea to make the lizard people and the queen herself a threat, but not a global threat, not a very large threat, not something you could take really seriously, at least in my opinion, within the first campaign. I think that was a very good move, and I think that's one of the reasons they were able to scale up the threats of the next few games, because they had more confidence now, and they knew what they were dealing with. Indeed, Mephistopheles himself, if I'm using the right guy, in Hordes of the Underdark, just barely starts his plan, ends up in the city whose name I don't even remember, and then you're right behind him. You're right on his tail, and you stop him. His whole worldwide conquest thing got stopped about 10 minutes into it. Now, that may sound cheap, but it was well done, well presented, and done correctly, done for the right reasons, because you can't do that sort of thing and still have it be canon. This is the same problem that comics tend to have with the Otherworld stories. And I'm not going to go into that whole thing, because that's basically a whole other topic by itself. But in general, I did like the way they presented the villains in this setting. and in this game. I'd also like to say, just as an aside, that one of the things I really liked about Neverwinter Nights and its two expansions is the music. Very well done music. Very well. It's very atmospheric when it needs to be, and when it needs to be dramatic, oh, it is. I love the menu music, especially. I gotta say, but when you're in a town or an area, sometimes they do that no music thing, but they kind of do because in the background you hear a lot of voice acting clips, fires, people, glass smashing against a building, stuff like that. To use the first chapter as an example, or you hear the woods and the whistling of the wind through the trees in the second chapter. It's very appropriate. It's all done for the right reason to help emphasize the setting and help emphasize the atmosphere of wherever it is you happen to be at the time. Very well done and definite props on that. Now, I have talked long enough about these games, I think. If it's not obvious, I give a very strong recommendation on all this to you guys, and I hope that I will talk to you soon because my throat really hurts. I'll see you guys.